5 minutes and an hour long. We're going to look at the new features and enhancements in Genero 250. We don't have time, of course, to look at all the enhancements and all the new features. There's just not enough time in an hour session or probably even a day session to cover everything. So we're just going to look at some of the highlights, and I'll demonstrate some of the highlights for you. And then we'll eventually, later this spring and summer, the plan is to focus in on some of these new enhancements and do individual sessions just on a particular enhancement or a new feature to give you a little bit more in-depth view of it. So that's the idea. Just an overview today of some of the bigger enhancements and features, but not a lot of detail. And then later we'll have individual sessions, especially if you send me an email and request a particular session on a particular enhancement. We'll try to do that for you. And otherwise, we'll just kind of pick the ones we like. All right, so during the session, which is a short session today, it's only going to be about an hour. If you need to leave and come back, you can do that at any time. You won't bother anyone. I've got everyone muted. I mentioned that earlier before the session started, just for your privacy. And a lot of times if I leave it unmuted, there's a lot of background noises and it makes it hard for everyone to hear and concentrate. So I do have you muted right now. But if you have a question, in a second we'll look at the control panel interface, and you can send me a message by chat in the session interface, and Shannon is watching for those for me today so I don't miss any. You can also send me an email later if you like. There's my email on the screen, lchildress@4js.com, and I will respond to any of the emails that I get. So if you think of something even next week, feel free to send me an email. This is the GoToTraining interface, just a quick slide here to get you familiar with it. I think a lot of you are already familiar with it from previous webinars and classes, but just in case, just a couple of slides. This part over here on the right-hand side, this area here is your control panel where you can select your different options, for example, between telephone and mic and speakers. If you have problems with audio during the session, you might switch over to telephone and see if that works better. If you click on that telephone option, it should give you a phone number that you can use to call in. You can also minimize your control panel with the red arrow so it doesn't take as much of your desktop, take as much real estate during the session. If I had you unmuted, you can mute and unmute yourself with the mute button here, the green button. And then down here's the one I was asking for a few minutes ago, the raise hand icon. Sometimes I'll ask you if you can hear me okay, or ask you a question or for a response to a question, and you can use that raise hand icon to get my attention too if you need to. And then down here at the bottom is the chat interface. So there's just a larger picture of the control panel. I think we've covered it pretty well already, so I'm going to skip over that for now. And Shannon said that you can hear me okay, or she can hear me okay, so instead of going ahead and doing another audio check, I think it's probably safe to go ahead and save a few minutes of time that way. So let's go ahead and jump right on in. Genero 250 is a major release, so there are a lot of new features and new enhancements. As I mentioned before, we'll cover some of the highlights here in the session today. But I mentioned we won't have time to look at everything or talk about every feature or enhancement. So I want to start out the session today with a quick look at the doc, because the documentation has all the details about the new features and the new enhancements. So it's kind of a good idea to look at that so you'll know where to go if you have some questions about a particular feature later on. Maybe I didn't cover it in quite enough detail for you. So let me just go ahead and pop this up. We can take a look at it live here instead of looking at the screenshot. So just to show you, there's several places you can find the documentation, but one place that's easy to find it is 4js.com. If you go to the download menu option, there's documentation there. There we go. And then right here is the Genero 250 major release documentation. And you notice that there is documentation for every Genero product. So here's documentation for the installation guide, Genero Studio, the Genero suite including Studio and the additional Genero products. There's a special manual for Genero BDL, desktop client, gas, and so on. So we're going to start the session today looking at features and enhancements for Genero suite. So I'll use it for our example, looking at the doc. The first thing, in almost all of the products, you'll see an option to click on the release note doc. So the release notes, just like any product or software product that you've worked with, has a lot of information that we consider need to know now, right, as soon as you upgrade. So that's usually the first piece of documentation that we'll recommend looking at. So you can get to it here for most of our products. Just click on the option for it there and you can look at the release notes. Some of the more important information about the new release is in here. Known issues and restrictions, bug fixes, issue trackers, you can usually find in the release notes. Now if you don't find the release notes for a particular Genero product here, for example, I noticed this morning that BDL doesn't have the release notes listed here. You can also find the release notes on your system right underneath the installation directory for a particular product. You'll find the release directory, and the release notes will be there as well. So that BDL release notes, you'll be able to find those right there on your system after you've installed 250 or upgraded to 250. So that's the release notes. Something else we wanted to take a peek at is supported platforms and databases. Anytime there's a new release of Genero, we typically support maybe newer versions of various OSs, new versions of databases. Sometimes we deprecate support for older versions, so that would be something else you'd be interested in looking at. So here's our supported platforms and databases. And one thing, here's one of the new features I was going to mention here in just a few minutes. Notice we have Mac OS support now in Genero 250 for all the Genero products, all the way across the board. We previously did have support for some, for Mac with some of the products. I believe BDL, web services, maybe the desktop client. There were 2 or 3 products that we did support Mac OS with. But now notice that it's all the way across the board. All products are supported with Mac OS. This is the operating system list here with all the different flavors of operating systems that are supported. And then down towards the bottom, you see all the database information as well. So this is where you would go to figure out whether or not, for example, that it would be safe to upgrade your version of the database. Would it still work okay with Genero? Or do you need to upgrade your database? Maybe it's getting too old to be supported. And then finally, to look at all the details on new enhancements and new features, you can use the user guide for each product. And again, since we're starting with Genero Studio, I'm going to pick it for our example. Here's our 250 user guide. And if I select that, the very first thing at the top is what's new in Genero Studio version 250. And you can see here that it breaks it out by general enhancements, and then for each component of Studio there's a separate section, project manager, form designer, and so on. And if you scroll through there, you can see that there are a lot. So be far beyond our ability to cover all of those in an hour, but here they are in case you want to come back and look at some of them later. And we have the same format for all the different products for Genero, not just Studio. All right, that's probably all I need to show you for that, but I just wanted to kind of show you that live so that you could see what it looks like. Here's our supported platforms and databases in the What's New section. Now one thing that I'll be pointing out probably as we go along, one of the new enhancement is all the documentation for all the Genero products, not just Studio. This just happened to be a good place to point it out in this very first section. You've noticed or will notice that all the documentation is a little different in the new version, and that's because it's been migrated to DITA, Darwin Information Typing Architecture. So the format looks a little different, but it's got some nice features for reuse of content, single sourcing of content, and that type of thing. And it's kind of just become the standard for a lot of folks for documentation and content management, or for content. So now to Genero Studio, general enhancements, and you saw the big list in the documentation in the user guide a few minutes ago, so you know this won't be a complete list. But some of the highlights, I just saw the Mac OS support in our platform and database support documentation, so we've already talked about that. But we also have a version of Genero Studio for Mandarin Chinese in Genero 250, so Chinese support. My coworker here in Irving, Lily, worked long and hard on translating a lot of the messages, for example, in Genero Studio to Chinese, and I hear that she did a great job. We've got some changes for remote studio host configurations. I imagine some of you are probably familiar with the idea that Genero Studio has two basic installation options. You can do what they sometimes call a standalone Studio install, where you install the whole Genero stack, typically on an individual system, and a developer kind of works in the standalone mode, where he does all the work on his individual machine, his development machine. But we also have a remote installation option, where you have a Genero Studio server on a remote server, and then you work on your local machine with Genero Studio client, and that client connects to the Genero Studio remote server to do your work, and that's a fairly common configuration. So for these Genero Studio remote host configurations, there's been some enhancements in 250. One thing that's helpful for folks that have, for example, a slow connection between your Genero Studio client and the Genero Studio server on a remote host is that they support, or they do, remote builds now. So your project files are built remotely, which really improves performance for the build process. Something else that's nice for folks that maybe want to move around a bit and work on different machines. Maybe one day you work on your laptop, another a desktop machine. To make that easier with a remote config, now the configurations that you've set up and the build rules are all stored on the remote studio server as well. And that enables our developers to move around between different machines without having to recreate configurations and build rules. There is an import process for that, but it's very simple. It's documented in the Genero Studio user guide. It's just a few short steps. In fact, I can show you real quickly the basic gist of it. The configurations you've got now need to be migrated for 250. So the wrench icon, go back and show you that here in the corner. Hopefully you can see it, or I can use this one at the top. The wrench icon opens up your configuration management. And then down here, if you pick a particular configuration, you've got your environment sets and whatnot. So these are the configurations we're talking about migrating. And to migrate them, basic steps would be way down here at the bottom. You've got, right now I just have a local host configured. I'm doing everything in a standalone mode. But if I clicked on that, if I had a remote host that I used, it would show up in my list. And then I could go ahead and select that, go into my configurations, and this icon up here at the top allows me to import configurations. And when I selected that, it would allow me to pick from a list of configurations that I have from a, let's say, 240 version of Studio. So that's the general gist of importing or upgrading from an older version. It's very simple, very quick and easy. I don't have a remote host to show you, but that's how I would do it. Improved file compatibility. I can show you that quickly as well. Let's say that I have installed Genero 250, and I go in and try to open a file, or in this case a project that was created with an older version of Genero, instead of just going ahead and opening that and converting it to the new format or new changes associated with Genero 250, I get a dialog that asks me what I want to do. So it says if I want to go ahead and migrate it to the new version, I can go ahead and click Open, which is right here with my mouse pointing at it. But I can also click the Open in New Instance button if I prefer to open it with the older version of Genero. So that's there to support people that still have multiple versions of Genero installed and maybe are not ready to do the upgrade steps or migrate their applications to the new version. So you'll see that dialog anytime you try to open a file that was created with a previous version. Simplified configuration management. There's not a lot of differences in the functionality of the configuration management dialogues. It's just that it has a better, more intuitive layout. In the older version, and 240 for example, we did have the configurations and the environment variables available in the same screen, but you had to click a configure button to actually go in and configure environments, variables in the environment set. And now that's more intuitive and everything is all in one screen. I'll show you that in just a moment. In addition to that, we've got some functionality here for GAS for folks that are still in, let's say, development or testing mode. You've always been able to use this special GAS standalone connector called HTTP dispatch, and that kept you from being able, or kept you from having to implement a web server while you were still in testing mode or in development mode. So it was more or less a convenience for developers. You can use that GAS standalone mode a little bit easier now in 250 because there's a Start Script option. You can see here on the slide a checkbox. It's already highlighted. But you can click that checkbox. It's actually already clicked by default, and that will automatically start up this standalone GAS dispatcher or connector so that you can run your web client applications without having to go in and start it up manually. In the older versions, a lot of you know you have to go in as a separate step in the Start menu, for example, on Windows, or from the command line on Linux or Unix, and start up the HTTP dispatch process manually. So just a minor convenience, but it's nice. Anything in that direction is a good thing. So to show you the changes in the configuration management interface, right here when I open this up, it actually is more intuitive than it was in the older versions. I've got my configurations here on the left, just like I always have. I've got environment set information, all the environment sets that each configuration uses right here. But the part that's different from the older versions is having the environment variables available right here in the same screen. So if I wanted to go in and change the settings for SQLite, for example, I can do that right here in this main screen instead of having to use the configure button and go in and change it there. So just a nicer layout for that part. The GAS startup script right here, I almost forgot where to find it. There we go. Here's this Use Start Script checkbox that I was talking about a minute ago. Has all the settings in there to go ahead and start up HTTP dispatch and some options that you can change or configure differently if you want to for the startup script. And what that does for me is if I wanted to run an application with the web client, pick off the store here. Notice nowadays I don't have to go out and start up that HTTP dispatch process manually, right? That connector starts automatically because of that new start script. Something else in Studio that's improved is there's a new diff tool, or the diff tool has changed quite a lot. It's color-coded. It has single or dual pane options. It has a revert option that's pretty handy that you can use to revert back out of a change that you've made if you change your mind or realize you made a mistake. So let's see, I need a good file that I can use to work with that. I guess I'll just use this one since it's handy. It's always easier when you're not trying to make it do something. So let's say I get ready to pop up here. Here's my options. Right now I'm just using normal editing mode. I can switch over here to single pane diff mode, which shows me my color-coded changes, but not specifically things maybe that I've deleted or modified. I can just see that I have deleted or modified things. There is a two-pane diff mode. So in one pane you have a read-only version of the file. Let's say I'm just working with two files on disk. One pane, the left pane, will have a copy of the file as it was when I opened the file, and then on the right-hand side will be my live copy of the file that I'm editing. So let's go ahead and switch to that, just so you can see the dual pane mode here. So this copy over here is read-only. If I go in and try to change something, notice it won't let me. It's just sitting there. This copy over here is my live editing copy. So if I go in here and make some changes, notice over here in my left-hand pane, now I have some red color coding over there in the margin that tells me that something's been deleted. If I modify something, that should show up in orange. Right, so that's the default colors. You can change those though in preferences. And let's see, what do I need to do? Maybe add something. So I'll add something as well. And notice that when I add something, it shows up in green. So we've got color coding there to let us know what's going on. Now over here on this side, what I can do is locate my changes here. And I've got options up here to make that quick. Right, here's go to the next difference, go to previous difference. So I could use that, or I can right-click and have context-sensitive options. But let's say I start here, and I'm not happy with my change. I can say copy to right. And what that will do is whatever's on the right side, the unedited copy, will be copied back over to my live copy that I'm editing. Maybe I'm not happy with this. I can be in either pane, notice when I make the change, and I'm like, I don't really like that, so I'm going to copy to right. So that's a way to copy what's over in the, we'll call it the base copy of the file, back over to my live editing copy. And maybe I'm really sorry that I deleted that, so again I can copy to right and undo it. So just some nice changes with diff to make it easier for you to see the changes, see what's been modified, added, and deleted very quickly. You can also do it from the command line or start a diff session from the command line. There's the Genero Studio command line option where you can specify two different files. You also have options with diff to select a different base file for comparison if you want to. You have the option to select, for example, a copy of a file that's in a repository, a source control repository, SVN repository, if you prefer. If it's a generated application, then you have the option of working with the generated copy before the changes were made. And those options are available, of course, only if it's a generated application. Project Manager. Project Manager now supports other programming languages. The idea there is to make it easier for you to integrate libraries, for example, that you have maybe written in C or Java into Studio so that you don't have to go outside of Studio to do things like compile your libraries. So Java is actually built in. So let me just show you real quickly kind of what you're looking at. Notice that every application over here has now a language associated with it over here in the properties. So of course the default here is Genero, but we also have Java now that's built into Studio in 250. So if I had some Java libraries, for example, are Java extensions I wanted to add to Studio. What I would typically do would be to go up and add a new library. And then I'm not going to bother to name that library right now, but then that's where I would put my Java library, my Java code, and then over here for that library I would specify that it was Java. So that enables me to be able to compile my Java code right here inside of Studio instead of having to do that elsewhere. All right. Went backwards instead of forwards. There's also a deploy project option in Project Manager. The whole idea here is just to create an empty directory structure that has the recommended structure for deployment to an application server. So it's not a huge deal. You could certainly do it manually if you wanted to, but it's just another convenience, kind of like starting up that HTTP dispatch process automatically for you. So it's a similar type thing. So it creates a recommended directory structure. Here, show you how you get to it. You just go to File, New, and then under Genero Files, there's a Deploy Project option. Has asked you for a couple of things here, a little bit more information. The project name, I'm just going to make something up, Hello World, and then the location where you want to deploy the project. So I'm going to put it there so I can find it easily. I even made a special directory for it so it would separate it. And now if I go look at that, I have to drag it up here for a second to get to that. There we go. I'm going to discard those. I see my structure here in Project Manager. And then you have your disk structure here. So I have a bin directory. You can probably guess what most of these are for, but bin would be where you should store your executables. There's a config directory here for example, your gas application configuration files. Any images that you have here, report design files in the reports directory. Snippet files, gas snippet files would go there. Any source that you wanted to deploy on your application server, of course, would go in the source directory. And then styles is a bit of a misnomer because you would store your styles file here, but you would also store any other resource files, start menu files, toolbar files, and so on. Action default files. That's just a general directory for resource files. So not a huge feature or enhancement, more of a convenience that makes things handy for you. That's the idea with the deploy option. Metaschema Manager has some changes as well. There's a diff schema option where you can compare two different Genero metaschema files. So this would be like your .4dbs that you generate or .4dbxs that you use with Application Generator. And it will show you all the changes that you need to make to migrate from a reference schema to a user schema. There's a Generate Update Script option that you can use, that you can run to actually modify your database to match any changes that you've made to the Genero metaschema. Previous versions of the table, if you've, for example, deleted columns in the table, perhaps added new columns, deleted old columns, changed data types, that type of thing, any previous versions of the table as they are in the database, remember we're just changing the schema before we run this script, it will actually create a backup copy of the table and insert the data from the table that you're changing into that backup copy. So that way you have a backup copy of the table as it is before you make the changes. And then the new table is created if you've made a change to it that requires it, and the data gets migrated to that new table. And then just like we saw with the diff option, we have in the Meta Schema Manager an option to revert. So there's an enhanced revert action that you can use that actually says revert, where you can go in and change out or back out of any changes you've made to the Meta Schema. So up here in the database, we've got the diff schema option. You can specify a left file and a right file to compare. Both of these would be Genero schema files. And then, of course, it will open that up in schema editor so that you can see the schema analyzer so that you can see the differences in the schema diagram. If I make changes to a schema, let's say I go in and make some changes to this guy, this sign-on table, and I add a column. Maybe I delete a column. I can generate a script now if I'm happy with that. There's a generate database creation script. And I can select that, and I've got all kinds of options here. I can specify the database, of course, that I'm generating the script for. That would be important. And then all kinds of options for primary keys, foreign keys. Do I want it to generate those for me or not? So then I hit the generate button. It goes ahead and creates that script for me. So here you can see it's got a main. It calls two functions, db drop tables, db create tables for my example, because I did make some pretty drastic changes to my table. I dropped a column and added some columns. So here's where it's creating a table with all the proper constraints and so on. Option to drop the table after it's built that new table. And if I run that, then it will actually make changes to the database. I'm not going to run it, of course. I was just playing. So I'm going to cancel out of that. And I'm also going to show you the revert option here. I've made these changes to this table. So if I decide I'm not happy with those, I can revert. Here's the revert option we were talking about. And here it's giving me information about what I'm reverting or what properties I'm reverting. So it's going to restore the password column and delete tet, which was the column that I added. So if I revert, I'm back to the way I was. Business application modeling. If you're familiar with business application modeling, that's a tool we've had in Genero Studio since version 240 that will let you model to design an application instead of actually having to sit down and write the code for it. So it will create the business logic needed and actually create the code for you for database applications to be able to go in and create, insert, create, update, and delete database tables. So a very handy tool. It's been enhanced and changed to improve it ever since it came out. So at this point we're on DB App 3.0 for what they call the template that actually is used to generate the generated code. That template is really a directory that has the build rules and libraries and programs that are used to generate your code. So the 3.0 template has some improvements. There's native serial management for Informix. The more portable method and traditional method with Genero for managing creation of unique IDs for, let's say, customers, orders, that type of thing, is to use a separate table, this SEQ seq reg table. And it's actually used to keep track of columns in databases that are using unique identifiers. I'll call them serial values that need to be incremented every time you add a new record. So that's a portable way that works with any flavor of database. But for Informix, it actually will use native Informix serial columns instead. So serial columns in databases, if you're using Informix, are now supported in this new template. New constraint management. The constraint management for generated code is talking about checking the business records for the generated code to make sure that the primary keys are generated, foreign keys are generated, and so on. There's a special source file, .4gl file, that has these constraint management checks, or the code for the constraint management checks in it. Another feature that I first learned about in Informix that's supported with the new template is Cascade Delete. So the idea with Cascade Delete, I can show you here, let me find a good one, is based on the foreign key. Now how about this one here? Here's, we've got a relationship here, a foreign key between orders and account based on user ID. And the idea here, let me just say edit so you can see, this foreign key has a Cascade Delete checkbox. And what that would do is if I go in and delete a customer account that currently has orders, then the orders will automatically be deleted when the user account is deleted. So the parent table that has children in another table, it will actually automatically delete the child records. So in this case, it's accounts with orders. So if I delete an account and it has existing orders, the orders will be deleted as well. So that's a nice feature. Concurrency management is enhanced in this new template, the DBApp3 template. Optimistic locking doesn't actually put a lock on a row. It's a little bit of a deceptive term. What it does actually is create a kind of a before image record of a row that the user is about to change. And if the user changes it and he's prepared to make that a committed change, then it compares the values in this before image record, it's just a program record that you use, with the current values in the database. And if they haven't changed, then it goes ahead and allows the update to happen. If the program record with the copy of the record in it before the user makes the change doesn't match what's in the database, that tells us that another user has perhaps gone in and made a change to that record before we changed it, and then we can roll back the work, right? We don't want to make the change if someone else has gone in and made a change already. So that's optimistic locking. It doesn't actually do the locking, but it's a portable way of handling locking versus using something proprietary, like declaring a cursor with hold, for example, which only works, let's say, with some databases like Informix. Optimistic locking, this method, is portable for all databases, so that's the benefit to using it. So, new features, properties in the business application diagram let you customize user interface behavior. The easiest way to describe this too is just to show it to you real quickly. I'm going to open up my business flow diagram here. And let's take a look at this account form. Grab that and get it out of the way. So here's some UI settings properties for this form. And notice that there's an open mode and a default mode. The open mode I think I just changed it by mistake. By default is display. Or excuse me, yep, it is display. And in the default mode is also display. And then down here you can change display behavior, modify behavior, add behavior, and tell it exactly what behavior you want it to have if a user accepts or cancels. So the default is returned to default mode, but you could also say if a user accepts, I want to return to caller mode, or the mode that it was called in, or exit form or exit app. So you have a lot of different options that you can use to change the behavior for a particular form. So up here, just to kind of demonstrate what happens here, let's just run the account application. That's the easiest way to see it. Let me switch back here to the desktop client. All right, so here's what we have it set to now. With our default settings was display. So notice when the form pops up, it's in display mode. If I change the property for my open mode here from display to modify, and run it again, notice this time I'm in modify mode, update mode. So it's a quick and easy way to change the behavior of your generated code with just a few settings in the properties. So that's what this is referring to, customization for UI behavior. We talked about cascade delete supported. So from there, we're switching out of the Genero Studio enhancements, and now we're looking at a few VDL or FGL enhancements. So we're switching gears a bit to FGL. Something new in FGL is the concept of modularizing your dialogues. Some of these dialogue blocks are getting very large and hard to maintain. So a couple of nice things about creating modularization for dialogues is that we can reuse a dialogue that we've created. So we can maybe use the same interactive dialogue in multiple modules by using this method. And also it makes the code easier to maintain and the code easier to read if you're trying to kind of work your way through it. You can also use this method to be able to test individual, we'll call them sub-dialogues, pieces or parts of your overall dialogue block. So in Genero 2.10, we came up with the concept of multiple dialogues. So this builds on the concept of multiple dialogues. Multiple dialogues allowed you to have a dialogue block, kind of an overarching dialogue, which we see here. This dialogue, attributes, and so on. So this is a dialogue block. And then within this dialogue block, we can have multiple sub-dialogues. We could have a display array, or two display arrays like we see in this example. We could have a display array, an input array, or an input statement, any of the interactive dialogues, construct, and so on. So it's a nice feature because it modernizes the look and feel of your user interface, because now users can do things like move between different parts of the form without having to commit or cancel out of a particular part of the form. So it's a more modern look and feel. So that's one of the benefits to it. It's kind of modernizing your code. Other than that, it's nice because you can kind of manage all these sub-dialogues now in a modular way. So here in 250, you're able to actually break up these really large dialogues into sub-dialogues. And the sub-dialogues, kind of like functions that you might put in separate modules, behave the same way. I can have a separate module that defines some sub-dialogue code, and then from within what we call a procedural dialogue block, which is just where your dialogue block would go, you can reference these sub-dialogues, these declarative dialogue blocks that are in other modules. So let's just take a look at an example, because that doesn't sound very clear. So this is what we call a declarative dialogue block. So if you look at it, it looks a lot like a function, and it behaves a lot like a function. This is where you would define a sub-dialogue, an interactive dialogue, in a separate module. So it looks like a function, You can't actually pass parameters to a dialog like you can a function, so that's not possible, but you are allowed to define local variables. So you see here that they do define a local variable in this example. So notice that the level that you use for declarative dialogues is at the same level as you would create a function. So very similar to putting a bunch of functions in a separate module for reuse. We're doing the same thing with sub-dialogues. So we have our declarative dialogues, which by themselves are not doing anything, but we can reference those declarative dialog blocks in our procedural dialog blocks. So over here on the right-hand side, we've got a customers.4gl module, and within the scope of this function, function co-list, I have a procedural dialog block. So this is what you're more familiar with. If you've used multiple dialogues, then this is what you're familiar with seeing. You've got a function, you've got a dialog block, and then within that dialog block, you have perhaps multiple sub-dialogues. So here's a sub-dialog, an input statement, an input interactive dialog, and then down here is our reference to our sub-dialog that's in the orders module, a separate module. So this is where we reference the sub-dialog. Notice you have to specify the module that the sub-dialog has been created in, which is orders, right? This module over here was called orders.4gl, and then the name of the sub-dialog as it was given in the declarative dialog block. So that's fairly straightforward, fairly simple, but notice that it makes these maybe previously very large dialog blocks a lot easier to read and maintain, because I can go in and compile these sub-dialog modules separately. So it's easier to compile. I can focus in on a specific sub-dialog, and I can reuse these sub-dialogs in different modules if I want to, so they're reusable. We have the same concept for forms in 250. The forms that we're referring to, though, are just per files. We don't really need the advantage of form modularization with form designer files, but the per files, they're text-based files, and especially with the support of folders and folder pages, some of these per files can get very large and unwieldy and hard to maintain. So really, this enhancement is just for these large per files. So it doesn't apply to form designer files at all. So you can create, just like you saw with modularized sub-dialogs, you can create separate per files that contain sub-forms or a sub-form, and then in a form, in the layout section, you can reference a sub-form, and it gets pulled in and embedded in the form at compile time. There's a few limitations you see down here at the bottom. You're not allowed in a sub-form to create toolbars or top menus. And you also have to be careful that since you're actually combining a couple of forms, that your screen records in these forms are unique. You can't have the same name for a screen record in Form A as you do in Form B if you're using the form clause to embed Form B into Form A. So here's an example. It actually is kind of a truncated example. We've got this very example out there under the FGL directory where you've installed the BDL product. There's a demo directory, multiple dialogues, and then there's a folder directory with these samples. So there's a folder.per file, this one here, and a donation.per or donations.per. So folder.per is a form that uses the form clause in the layout section. So right here they've got a folder, and then they're defining a page inside that folder, so a folder container with a page container inside of it. But instead of putting all the instructions or the format for this page here inside the form, they're modularizing it by calling in or referencing a subform called donations.per. And here's what that subform looks like over here on the right-hand side. So a very simple concept, but it makes the forms, these large forms, a lot easier to read. Better UTF support. UTF-8 is supported on Windows now, or officially supported on Windows. You have an environment variable called lang that you would set to enable that. And to go along with UTF-8, we have support for linked semantics. What they're referring to there is byte linked semantics, or sometimes called BLS, or character linked semantics, or CLS. The default is byte linked semantics, which doesn't work very well with UTF-8. The idea with byte linked semantics is that each character takes up 1 byte, which isn't always the case when you're using UTF-8 and you're working with multi-byte character languages. So if you decide to use UTF-8 and you're working with multi-byte character languages, like for example Chinese, it's a very good idea to switch to character linked semantics, or CLS. But before you do switch to character linked semantics, or CLS, you would want to make sure that any database or database clients that you have configured are also, let's say, UTF-8 ready and are also able to use CLS. You wouldn't want to mix and match between your Genero and your database. So that's something you would need to look into. Make sure they match. Don't switch to CLS, for example, without looking into your database first. We also support JSON. You might be familiar with JSON. It's JavaScript object notation, just a lightweight data interchange format for JavaScript, but it's become kind of the standard method of parsing and serializing data objects for transfer between disparate processes or disparate systems. It's more efficient than the older method, or kind of the traditional method, I guess, XML. It's a lot shorter and easier to process, and more human readable than XML. Built on 2 structures, a collection of name-value pairs. For some language it's realized as an object, other languages it's realized as records, hash tables, and so on. The other structure is an ordered list of values, typically realized as an array, but depending on the language it might be a vector, a list, or a sequence. So most modern languages now have embedded JSON parsing and serialization, and now Genero is one of those languages with 250. So here's a JSON sample. This is a nice formatted JSON string. You can see here just the pieces and parts. This is one of our structures we were just talking about here, an object. This is a collection, for example, of name and value pairs that we would realize in Genero as an object. This one's nested, right? So you can create some pretty complex data structures with JSON. And then down here, the brackets, the square brackets, are arrays, or at least they're realized as arrays in Genero. So that's our name value pairs there that are specified as an array. Array elements are separated by commas. So that's what a JSON string looks like, or JSON looks like. I'll call it a JSON structure. Now we provide support for serializing Genero record variables to a JSON string with special JSON classes. And of course you can go the other way as well. You can convert Genero program variables to JSON, and you can also parse them and convert them, JSON variables, back to a JSON string. So you can go both ways. And you would use methods from this JSON class to do that. Here we've got an example, JSON serialization, so you can see one of these class methods at work. So here to serialize, we can generate a JSON string that represents any Genero record. So we're just converting our record to a JSON string. And we've got a special method, JSON.stringify, that we can use to do that. So they're just defining a record here, defining a string, and then using this special JSON.stringify method to convert the record to, in this case, a flat formatted JSON string. All right, switching over to some new features in GAS. HTML5 is now the default. The other themes have been deprecated in favor of HTML5, which is kind of the standard. We also have support now for single sign-on. We've got some enhancements to the application server that supports single sign-on. Kerberos is deprecated. We had, I think, a few customers that had already gone through the process of implementing Kerberos on their systems. And for those folks, I don't think it was a difficult process to integrate Genero with that, or to include Genero in their Kerberos configuration. But for the customers we had that just wanted to implement Kerberos for use with Genero, I think the process of implementing Kerberos was pretty painful and a lot of work. So we've deprecated Kerberos in favor of kind of new methods of supporting authorization and authentication nowadays. I think the particular favorite is single sign-on, or SSO. So for single sign-on for authentication and authorization, we're promoting OpenID and SAML, which is short for Security Assertion Markup Language. The idea here is we've got some special web services dedicated to those two, we'll call them protocols, I guess, for me, having lack of a better word, that's built in now, are embedded in the GAS that supports single sign-on if you're using one of these two methodologies. The key part of that is we're actually not doing any of the authentication or authorization inside of a Genero application. We're farming that out or delegating that out to another service, a third-party service. There's a good tutorial in the GAS user guide if you want to see how that works and how to implement it, and here's the specifics. If you'd like that, you can send me an email if you would like that address, and I'll be glad to send it to you. There's also a deployment option in GAS that you can use for packaging and deploying applications on our services. I'm just going to give you a very short overview here because I am planning to do a special session on Genero Archive as a separate session, so I'll get into more of the details there. So here I'll just say it's an easy way to package and deploy applications or services to an application server. We've implemented a few new commands, actually one new tool, FTL-GAR, that you can use to create the archive, and then we've added enhancements to the GAS admin command to deploy the archive. Did I say deploy up here? The FTL-GAR is to create the archive, and then GAS admin can be used to deploy the archive. I might have said that backwards before. So two new commands to help you bundle everything up, package it up, and deploy it on the application server. And then GAS admin has some additional new commands to work with archives. When you deploy an archive, it's not actually available until you enable it with a GAS admin command. So there's a command in GAS admin to do that. There's commands to list deployed archives. There's also commands to disable a deployed archive and undeploy it, even clean up the files if you want to, if you change your mind altogether about deploying it or you need to redo it. When you do a deployment, it doesn't include any software that's required. So it doesn't deploy, for example, Genero software or database software. All of that is still done the traditional way. We have support for sticky web services in GAS in 250. Sticky web services uses an HTTP cookie to make sure that requests from a specific user agent are always routed to the same DVM, the same virtual machine. The way it does that is it starts a dedicated virtual machine for a web services client that's been defined as sticky, sets an automatic cookie to identify the client, and then any subsequent requests from that client have the cookie sent along, which identifies it, or identifies the DVM that it's supposed to be sent to. So that's the way that we've implemented sticky web services, an HTTP cookie that's managed by the application server. And then finally, I know we're about out of time, but there's a few, just a quick overview of enhancements for Report Writer. Primary enhancements are table layouts. So we have these new table layouts in Report Writer that allow you to work with data in columns and rows. So there's a special new element called a table element. There's another new element for pivot tables, a special pivot table element that lets you work with pivot tables if you're familiar with those. Same basic concept that you've seen maybe in Excel if you've worked with Excel. The idea is there is being able to group and summarize large volumes of data and be flexible and change things around with it to see different views of the data. So we'll look at that here in just a bit. We also have support for QR codes. We already had barcode support, so this is just an enhancement to our already existing barcode support. We now support QR codes as one of our types of barcodes. Some designer enhancements that make the report designer a bit easier and more intuitive to work with. For example, footers now appear at the bottom of the page where you would expect to see footers. Section rotation lets you rotate, just like it sounds, rotate a section of your report one way or the other. You've got some options to pick from that. Distributed mode is, to improve performance by starting up the report engine as a daemon so that applications can connect to that to process reports. So it's a fast way to get reports processed by connecting to that already running daemon. Backside printing, which is fairly self-explanatory, and runtime localization, which allows you to specify different localization settings for a report than the language, the application language that you're using. So here's our new table object. There's some good samples. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to pop over here and show you where these samples are. Over here in the welcome page, there's a reports project. If you'll open up the reports project, you can see we have a lot of report samples here. This order reports, if I run that, it brings up a dialog so that I can select a report to look at. First one here is table demo that I can use, and that's what a table looks like, right? So this is that new report element called a table that let me create much more simply a report that uses columns and rows. Now for pivot tables, we have an example of a static pivot table, and a static pivot table just means that what they call the dimensions, which is the way the data is grouped, is predefined. So all the dimensions and measures, which is what we would use, for example, to aggregate data, has already been predefined for the report. We don't let our user go in and specify how they want the data grouped or measured, how they want it aggregated. So this is an example here of a static pivot table that you can look at in our examples and see how it works. Oops, I accidentally ran the same one again. And then finally, here's an example of a dynamic pivot table where we allow the user to go in and specify. What they call dimensions is how we want our data grouped or sorted. We can sort it by customers, by orders, and so on. Here are selected dimensions. We just use drag and drop to pick those. So we've already picked product category and shipping area for the example. You can allow the user to specify measures, ways we want the data to be specified by value or aggregated. And just real quickly, I'll run that one so that you can see that out of the way, what it looks like. So here's one that's been sorted, used dimensions of zip code, a product category, and shipping area, and then measurements are zip code, unit price, and total unit cost. Not a very great example that I picked there, but you get the general idea. The idea is to allow the user to select the dimensions and measures for the pivot table. All right. So I believe that puts me out of time for the session, and we were able to finish the session pretty well. Let me just quickly show you. Here's the layout direction we were talking about that lets you specify the layout for a section of the report. You can specify turn right, for example, turn left, and so on. And we did finish. It's a little concern there about report writer getting finished with it. So that's a brief overview of the components of Studio, VDL, GAS, and report writer. You can see there's a lot more, which is why we went through the doc earlier. And again, the plan is to have additional sessions later where we focus in on some of these more important enhancements or features. Perhaps sub-dialogues might be a good one. Maybe the report writer enhancements with pivot tables might be a good one. So if you have any suggestions for sessions you would like to see in the future, like 1-hour sessions like the one we had today, but just more details, feel free to send me an email. All right, I think we're finished for the day. Shannon, can you unmute? Do we have any questions? So if you don't have any questions, you're free to leave the session today. It will be recorded and posted on our website. So if you missed part of it or just want to review part of it again, you can find it on our website a bit later. Shannon says we have no questions, so our session for today is finished. Thank you very much. I appreciate everyone in attending and hope to see you soon in one of our focus sessions.